Thank you all for being here. After a very nice introduction, thank you, Lolita. All the things that I do, the kind of the research agenda that is listed on there is all true. But as they used to say in Monty Python, if any of you are familiar with Monty Python, they would have a segue that said, "Now for something completely different."
Yes.
And that's really what needs to be said right here, because as I'll explain in the course of what this talk, this is a very different sort of endeavor. In a lot of ways, there are connections, of course, but it's something completely different. And so thanks for being here. Lots of pictures and some show and tell, too, in the course of what I'll be saying. So what I'll be talking about today is a photo-ethnography project that I call Manuscriptistan. It's a new project for me, insofar as the first exhibition of the work isn't until this coming September. Though I published 2 images from the project in a photography journal last fall, using the Manuscriptistan title. Thus, technically, this was the first showing, I suppose, of the project. But as I'll explain, the project is also anything but new for me. At the end of the day, I see the images of Manuscriptistan as portraits of texts and spaces, which I've taken across a dozen or more places in 3 states in India. Kerala in the south, Telangana, sort of in the middle there, and Uttar Pradesh up in North India, which is where Lolita and I had an adventure in 2017. So I think a good place to start this talk is with a confession, and then move through the details of the title. And in the course of that, the project will sort of unfold. That should take up most of the time I think I have this afternoon. And if there's any time left over or during the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about the genesis of this project, and some of the technical details that have gone into it, what's happening now, and where it might be going in the future. So the confession. I would not use the label photographer to describe myself. I didn't go to art school, and if you ever encounter me at one of the camera company stores in Madison, where I do spend some time, you'll quickly discover that I have only the loosest command of the lingo that photographers use. I have taken photographs for a long time, however. Some of them I have even liked enough to share with others. In the early years of the present decade, some of my sharing led to 3 exhibits in Western New York. Those exhibits were primarily focused on people, and, truth be told, not all of the images that hung on the walls of those exhibits were taken with the central theme in mind. The statements I wrote for those exhibits were almost entirely post hoc reflections on pictures that I had gathered together. In contrast, the Manuscriptistan project was basically born in 2003, and from that year onward, I've been taking and assembling photographs with a fairly singular motivation in mind. Namely, to visually apprehend the literary objects, manuscripts, that I was seeing with some frequency in such a way that would help me appreciate what it felt like to be around them and see them on the shelves, and to capture something of the simultaneous understanding and uncertainty that being around them and looking at them seemed to rouse in me. As I'll explain, in the beginning I was encountering these manuscripts because I wanted to read them. Nearly everyone I have met at manuscript archives in India since 2003 has been there for one or a combination of 3 reasons, give or take. Because they work there, because they're a potential donor and are being given a tour of the space and collection in the hopes that maybe they'll donate some money, or because they're visiting scholars who want to access the knowledge contained in the text. They want to read them. The 3rd category was my category, but I was also always taking pictures, and this project, on reflection, put me in a novel 4th category, I think. It wasn't until 2015 that I was able to purchase some much needed equipment and fund the travel that I felt I had to do to move what began as just a keen interest, which often felt peripheral to my regular research agenda, into the realm of a research project. So it's kind of an old, new project, essentially, as I think back about it. Now I'll move into the title. So by using archives in the title of this talk, I have 2 things in mind. First, I'm asking you to think with me about the archive in a general dictionary definition kind of way. An archive is a place where public records or other important historic documents are kept. But I'm also hoping to reframe the way we look at the archive by asking, can the archive be art? As the title also suggests, I'm interested in particular types of documents. Manuscripts, books, texts, or other documents that were written by hand. The early history of writing in South Asia invites us to explore different ways of imagining book cultures and possibly even rethink the way we understand and relate to books and writing in North America today. For example, most of the manuscripts I have photographed are of a special kind, palm leaf manuscripts arranged in what's called a bundle form, with a number of folios of similar size pressed between two wooden panels slightly larger in size than the folios. The folios typically have one or two, depending on the size of the manuscripts, holes bored through them, through which a cord is passed to tie the bundle, like the one you can see right up here on the table that I've brought with me, which is actually not from India. This is from Sri Lanka, so it's not part of this project in any way. It's just something that, it's not even mine, actually. Somebody lent it to me for teaching purposes years ago, and it's still been with me after all these years. And I still use it in the classroom. That said, there are plenty of paper manuscripts in the mix of these photographs too, not to mention books, municipal documents, maps, and people. Handwritten manuscripts started to appear in South Asia well before the turn of the Common Era. B.S. Keshavan, who literally wrote the book on the book in India, it's called The Book in India, argued there was likely manuscript-style writing in South Asia as early as the 5th century BCE, since we have references to, quote, various types of material used for writing, such as leaves, wood or board, and bamboo chips or slips and metals, end quote, in the earliest layers of the polycanon. The reality is that it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when scribes in South Asia began writing texts. Or, more accurately, they inscribed texts using metal and wooden styluses on dried birch bark, palmyra, and talapat palm leaves in classical Indian languages like Pali, Sanskrit, and Tamil. Editions were produced and reproduced in this way for centuries, mostly with just text, but occasionally with images and rudimentary coloring. And now I'm going to try to just do a little demonstration to give you an idea about what these look like. So here's the string that's bored through. You can see this one's long enough that it requires two holes bored through the palm leaves, and this is a hard wood binding. It'd be like the covers of a book. Flip it over. Many of you maybe have seen these before, but if you haven't, this might be very, very new for you. You slide the cover up through this, and then you have a bunch of palm leaves stacked together on which a stylus was used to sort of engrave into the palm leaf. And this one, when you come up here, and you're welcome to come up after I'm done talking, you'll see it has some pictures on the top right here too. And then this one, interestingly, and they're not all like this, has both text on the front and on the back. It's about 100 years old, I'm told. Throughout South Asian history, royal families and wealthy patrons arranged to have manuscripts created for private libraries and places of learning. And many manuscript traditions were developed expressly for educational and ritual purposes. Historical references to manuscript production in India can be found in the travel records of Xuanzang in the 7th century, when he ventured into the region in search of Buddhist manuscripts, and Al-Biruni, 10th, 11th century, when he accompanied the Afghan ruler Mahmud of Ghazni during his incursions into India. Palm leaf manuscripts continued to be made through the medieval period, when a rise of texts in Persian appeared, while the Delhi sultans and Mughal emperors reigned over large parts of the subcontinent. Paper manuscripts, some of which were properly illuminated in the way that preservationists of manuscripts in the Western European traditions talk about them, with detailed color artwork, began to appear in northern India between the 11th and 13th centuries, enjoyed wide circulation by the 15th century, and eventually overtook palm leaves and other materials as the cardinal base for writing. Production of palm leaf manuscripts continued to hold sway among manuscript cultures in the south, however, and persisted in a few regions in the north, such as Bihar, Bengal, and Orisha, where palm leaf manuscripts from the 17th and 18th centuries have been found. By the end of the early modern period, palm leaf manuscript production began to slow across the subcontinent. The introduction of printing presses in the early 19th century stopped widespread production of both palm leaf and paper manuscripts across most of the region. Today, archives contain countless palm leaf and paper manuscripts across South Asia. Step into any one of these spaces and you'll find manuscript traditions revealing linguistic, religious, and cultural particularities that, when considered collectively, reflect the vast social, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the region. Manuscriptistan is a visual study of manuscripts and archives in India only, where the National Mission for Manuscripts in New Delhi estimates that about 7 million manuscripts are stored. Many scholars who use manuscripts in their research propose a much, much larger figure, however. Taking into account manuscripts in public and government libraries, as well as those in private collections, I have seen guesstimates reach as high as 30 million. I don't know how accurate that is, however. By either count, it's fair to say that India's manuscripts contain a massive amount of information about cultures and histories of India and its neighbors. Most of India's manuscripts have not been read or studied in recent decades, even centuries in some cases. And as a result, the condition of many of these documents is pretty poor. Paper manuscripts generally have a lifespan of 2 to 3 centuries before they become illegible and so brittle they can't be held. Palm leaf manuscripts, however, last a lot longer. For example, a palm leaf manuscript discovered in Nepal from the 9th century, the photo-ethnography, and a much older Spitzer manuscript, thought to be from around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, which is a Buddhist text from Central Asia, are among the oldest existing manuscripts we know about today. Notably, neither work is located in India today, however. The former, the photo-ethnography, is in Cambridge, England, and the latter is in Berlin. The lifespan of a manuscript greatly depends on the climate in which it's stored, and many archives in India cannot financially sustain climate-controlled rooms with non-damaging lighting. This fact prompted the National Mission for Manuscripts to organize a nationwide digitization program to photograph India's major manuscript collections before many of the works are lost to fungi and insect infestation that arise from imperfect storage conditions. The National Mission's digitization teams capture images of each page and leaf of every manuscript in the archives they've opted to digitize. Although it's a slow venture, the project will preserve important cultural and scientific knowledge for posterity and future study. It's already making available its massive database online, which presents enormous benefits for scholars of South Asian studies, as well as anyone interested in India's recent and not so recent past. The ideas, arguments, poems, scientific speculations, and much more contained in India's manuscript archives need to be preserved, and they should be available to everybody. Yet, this national project also presents some potential complications that impact the way we relate to the history of writing and the book in India. As manuscripts are digitized and made available online, India's rich and vital print culture inevitably gets reorganized into new categories to suit the digital age. Cataloging mechanisms and the livelihoods of employees of the archives are masked in the process. The archive is de- and recontextualized, resulting in a twofold effect. Digital preservation comes at the cost of erasing centuries-old archival mise-en-scène, deletion of the physical environment, where constraints are imposed on the text through taxonomic placement, impacting their likelihood of use by ordering the archivist and the reader's relationships with them, also threatens to expunge the material and classificatory frameworks that were created to organize knowledge expressed in manuscript form. Digitization doesn't account for, but rather obstructs, the architectural and spatial aesthetics of the archive. Shelves of palm leaf text stacked from floor to ceiling, sometimes wrapped in colorful cloth bundles, are telescoped into URLs that belie their impressive and sturdy histories as repositories of knowledge. We no longer dust off old manuscripts, read and restack them, but view them on clean and bright computer screens. Online pictures of manuscripts are edited for clarity, with measuring scales placed alongside them like a little ruler, alongside the leaves to show how big each one is in real life. The dimly lit sepia tone glow of the archive is absent in the online engagement. The online viewer misses the potent sight of an illuminated manuscript amid the grayscale landscape of concrete and brick walls, densely packed with text and row after row of wooden and metal shelving. In a very modest way, Manuscriptistan aims to curb some of this erasure by making these important spaces visible, and in so doing, providing prompts about organizational logics, preservation, and contemporary engagement with a past contained in text. Of course, I should add, the irony is not lost on me that the images I have taken and am showing amount to a kind of digitization as well, even if it's a very different kind. The ambit of topics and languages represented in the works one finds in the archives I have photographed is pretty staggering. For instance, in the location I have visited most frequently in Kerala, there's some pictures from it, the classical knowledge systems are amply represented. There are works on philosophy, poetry, drama, and theater, astronomy, medicine, aesthetics, and poetics, and so on, down the line. And manuscripts here are composed in Sanskrit, Pali, and Persian, as well as in most of the South Indian vernaculars, Malayalam, Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil. Archives in North India, in addition to the classical languages, tend, as you'd expect, to have an abundance of texts in North Indian languages, such as Hindi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Bangla, Urdu, and others. The title of this project uses the Persian suffix stan, meaning place of or country, to evoke the region's rich linguistic history and millennia of writing, hence Manuscriptistan, place of manuscripts, or manuscript country. Yet Manuscriptistan is not a study of the knowledge systems or languages that are printed in the palm leaf and paper documents themselves. Indologists have been mining these texts for centuries, translating them. I too have spent many hours in some of these archives I'm showing you today. The picture on the top left is one of the oldest pictures I'm showing you. It's from 2003. Spent a lot of time there in that archive. I too have spent many hours in some of these places, requesting certain manuscripts from the holdings, waiting in reading rooms for an archivist to bring them to me, or in some places even pulling them from the shelves myself. Typically for a fee or a donation to the archive, I could request photocopies of specific pages, or take from the text, or take pictures of them. I'd then bring these reproductions to wherever I happened to be living at the time, and translate them, and on occasion, incorporate the material into something I was or might one day be working on. This project, however, is different. It's not an attempt to translate or reconstruct India's past based on the content of the documents you see in these images. I said earlier that this project is a visual presentation of the literary objects I often see when I'm working in India, so that I can appreciate the feeling of being around them. And with these images, try to capture a sense of the understanding and improbability they sometimes stir in me. It seeks to present elements of archival spaces, storage structures, and still life images of the manuscript as artifacts. Images of the Manuscriptistan project convey socio-historical information, I believe. That these images can also incite responses in me that are epi-intellectual. That is, not entirely logical or sober, but bordering on affective and enthralling. Puts in stark relief the prospect of what I am doing, of what this project is doing, that it's also personal in visible ways that many of my other professional pursuits are not. Creating, editing, and framing an exhibit of 65 images out of thousands of images from multiple archives, for example, and this was in January, because this is a busy semester and I have to have these all ready for the exhibit coming up in August. So January was the time when I framed 55 of the pictures that will go into the exhibit. So creating this exhibit, framing these things, reveals more than my style of writing, the way I structure an argument, and the rationale for why I opt to do the work that I do. This project reveals some of these things, I think. But it also reflects something more, something different. My own taste, right? What the classical Indian literary theorists call rasa. And it displays my faculty for judging, which is how Immanuel Kant imagined taste in his third critique, the Critique of Judgment, which has had a tremendous influence on aesthetics in the West since the late 18th century when he wrote that work. Judgments of taste, Kant thought, determine whether or not something is beautiful. These are aesthetic determinations, he said, and they are based on feelings of pleasure, which is precisely why they gave him pause. Aesthetic judgments are prone to subjectivity and cannot, he said, amount to real knowledge. Kant's critique of judgment is concerned with abstract concepts and the relationship between a person's mental faculties and external objects that are sensed. How, he wanted to know, does one arrive at the judgment that something is beautiful? He was less interested in the thing held to be beautiful itself, or what the spectator feels, when seeing or hearing something beautiful. He wasn't particularly interested in the attempts of aesthetics, in other words, to explain what we experience when we look at a sculpture, hear a poem, or see a play. Unlike Kant, I'm not in the business of trying to devalue aesthetic knowledge. In fact, I find it to be important. Right? He did that in favor of scientific rationalism. I brought together the images of Manuscriptistan as a way to make a sustained inquiry into a collection of related responses I had in similar circumstances over many years. The images I ultimately selected to exhibit are, naturally, reflective of my own aesthetic judgment. I have aestheticized these objects and spaces, attempted to render them aesthetic, make them attractive or acceptable to so-called refined taste, or make them the subject of artistic treatment. I hope the ways I have framed, in all senses of the words here, of the word frame, the image suggests the presence of beauty in these spaces and objects, and they are capable of striking people and eliciting a response of pleasure or displeasure, expectancy or disbelief, concentration or amusement, or some combination of these feelings and others. Classical Indian aesthetics, Rasa Shastra, grapple with both sides of this matter. The thing in which beauty is thought to inhere, and the emotive experience of beauty in the viewer. Plus, it explored how to understand the production of beauty that arises from within and through the artist, though admittedly that I am least ready and willing to examine this part of the Indian aesthetic triad when I think about this project. My aesthetic judgments that have gone into the Manuscriptistan project might not amount to true knowledge in the Kantian sense. Kant was correct that aesthetic judgment is subjective. Even so, aesthetic knowledge can be true knowledge and have value for at least a cohort of one. Right? Me. I, of course, don't expect others to respond to the images in the way that I responded to the spaces and the things when I took these pictures. But I find solace in the fact, in Kant's observation, that people make judgments of beauty with the belief that other people will agree with this conclusion, suggesting that there is, somewhere, a sensus communis, a community of taste, where my judgments about beauty align with those of others. In this regard, I think it's worth noting that one of the things I most enjoy about doing this project, even if I hope to tap into a community of like-minded or like-tasted people, Manuscriptistan is not aimed at a particular audience. Since 2015, I've shared some of these images with others. Now 2 of the images are in print. And once the exhibit in Philadelphia opens, the material will reach many people I will never know. Sure, a lot of academic research operates just like this, in fact. We can't predict who will and who will not engage with what we write, or for that matter, how they will respond to it if they do. But unlike most of the things I write, which are, I imagine, mostly picked up by South Asianists, and maybe others interested in medicine and religion, but most likely it's an academic audience, these images will reach people totally unconnected to South Asian studies and academia. Differences in audience reception of the photographs I have made public so far has been both illuminating and fascinating to me. So, the matter of response to beauty is an important aspect of the project overall, though it's also something I can't fully address until I have the opportunity to present the work more widely. The Indian theorist Bhattanayaka from the 9th-10th century argued that the only genuine response to beauty is complete absorption, vishranti, where the subject experiences the pleasure of a consciousness untouched by the things of this world. Aesthetics helps us to explore and explain what happens when we enter into another world. As Sheldon Pollock recently put it, this other world, he continued, is by some measure an unreal one, and losing ourselves in it completely is an almost everyday occurrence, but one that gains in mystery because it is quotidian. To watch ourselves watching something unreal and willingly embracing that real unreality, no matter how sad or terrifying, is to enter into a fascinating hall of mirrors. Making sense of the reflections in this hall is what aesthetics, in part, is concerned to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that the images in this Manuscriptistan project are otherworldly, because they're not. Nor are they mundane, however, especially not in the lives of most Indians today, and perhaps they never were. A hope I have for this project is to convey some visual insights about how and where Indian historical data and ideas have been assembled, while at the same time providing images that evoke the weightiness and textures of learning and history, however these things might feel for someone, irrespective of the viewer's prior knowledge of India's manuscript cultures. Now, by way of conclusion, I'd like to say a few words about what I mean when I call this a photo-ethnography project. The photo part of that term is now obvious, I hope, but the ethnographic part might not be. In the process of compiling the images for the exhibit later this year, since 2015, I have approached each archive with an aim to also document and present some of the people who manage the spaces where manuscripts are held. People whose livelihoods are influenced by and connected to the archives, including catalogers and preservationists, university administrators, faculty and students, security guards, and maintenance staff. These people have stories about the collections and relationships to them that, unsurprisingly, differ from my own and those of the other scholars I know who work in many of these places. These people and the experiences they bring to the archive add to Pollock's Hall of Mirrors metaphor, since in many cases they literally hold the keys to these spaces, and without fail, they query me about why I'm there and want access to certain manuscripts or why I want to take pictures. As I think across my encounters in India's manuscript archives, both public and private, there seems to be an overriding concern among the directors and owners at many of these places that the knowledge contained in the manuscripts is not only culturally valuable, perhaps even scientifically profitable, as was the case of the medical manuscripts that were the subject of my first tour through Kerala in 2003 to document the state's various collections, but also that the knowledge contained in these texts is proprietary to this place in India, this family, if it's a private collection, this community, this institution, sometimes even this country. There are historical reasons for this line of thinking, of course, and scholars have addressed this by discussing the relationship of post-colonial societies, not just to their own histories, but, in this case, to the texts that are thought to contain aspects of the past that predate and or do not reflect a colonial interruption in the production of a people's history, literatures, philosophy, science, and the like. What might be done with this knowledge in the text, and what might be done with the knowledge in these texts if it got into the wrong hands, for example? It's a perfectly reasonable question, and it's a question that I've heard people ask me and people that I've been with throughout these years. But it's a question that always prompts me to wonder, at the end of the day, who owns knowledge? This is all to say that it's often a challenge to get into many of these archives without multiple connections. Even when it seems like I've been equipped with an arsenal of institutional affiliations and signatures, there are no guarantees of admission, as Lalita was pointing out earlier. Entry into private collections is just as elusive as without the proper people to vouch for you. In an unexpected turn of events, in many instances that I've gotten into an archive with permission to do a photo shoot, just a photo shoot for this project, there has actually been more curiosity about my intentions than when I've asked to read specific texts or to photocopy pages from texts. Why would anybody want to take pictures of these spaces? In the end, I owe a great deal of thanks to the many people who have assisted me since this project's inception. Archivists, catalogers, preservationists, who have taken the time to walk me through these spaces and explain the holdings and their histories. The professors and students of manuscript scriptology who have shown me the nuances of different manuscript cultures in Indian history. The office administrators and security guards who have kept the lights on for me when I've overstayed my welcome. And the friends and colleagues, perhaps you recognize one down here in the lower left, thanks Lolita, who accompanied me to some of the archives in these images, and so crucial to this work, occupied the archive staffs with conversation and questions while I could steal away into the stacks and lesser used corners of these spaces to try and locate just the right image. Thanks, that's it.
Thank you for reminding me what India